So, Miriam, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, I know that you are involved with addiction. In particular, you spend your world in the female, side of addiction. What is unique to the female struggle with addiction?
Okay, so I would say that the female struggle of addiction is mostly that there's like this false notion that women don't have an issue with alcoholism and substance use and other addictions as well. It was more of like a male thing. And because of that, there's a lot of shame in coming forward and saying that they have addiction, but not only coming forward, even recognizing that they have it. It's kind of like, I'm struggling, but how could this be alcoholism if I'm a woman?
Hmm.
So those two pieces make it very hard for them to be supported with their addiction.
Hmm.
I would say I even have like women that come in actually to support their spouses. It's so easy for them to recognize that their spouse has something. And through the process of looking at them and then looking at themselves, they realize that they also have some sort of addiction as well and are then afraid to face it, but then they end up facing it and living much more meaningful lives.
So, it's interesting, and what you're saying is fascinating. That for whatever reason, it becomes harder for them to see their own addictions. So, how does somebody notice it? Like, what are some of the maybe the clues or the awarenesses when someone's engaged in behavior, whether it's in eating or an alcoholism or any other type of behavior that would, I guess, fall into behavior that wouldn't be obvious? My sense is if you're in using certain drugs, I guess right away it may be easier, but I guess in other types of substances, it may be harder to recognize the point in which you go into the world of addiction. So how does one begin to see that awareness?
So oftentimes it happens slowly over time, and other times it's pretty quick. You said something about like drugs being something that is easier to recognize, but it's actually interesting because I work with women who some of them actually had like a C-section, and then because of that got prescribed for even like back things, but specifically things that are like OB related, and they don't realize once that addiction is stronger because they think like, oh, my doctor prescribed it. But even in relation to other addictions, I would say that some of the signs, I mean, in general, the signs of addictions, not just women, is when their lives become unmanageable, their relationships become um, sort of like empty, and the noise between them and other people is so great that they can't really have relationships that are really meaningful anymore. And obviously, when things become dangerous and scary, it's hard to recognize it when they themselves are in it. Oftentimes, their loved ones try to point it out to them, but kind of crossing over that threshold is not something that happens very quickly. So it is harder to see. That's about it.
So, what role, and I wonder from your perspective, if again from the female perspective and the male perspective, if it's different. So you'll tell me, what's the role that the family plays in, both in maybe recognizing it, but also in the impact when once it's recognized and how they can be helpful to help that person get through it.
So the two words that come to mind are being supportive, but then also not enabling. By that, I mean being supportive is really recognizing that this isn't something that once they're really in the addiction, it's not something that they're choosing anymore. Um, Understanding that we really can't judge them. They're human beings that are really struggling. And then the not like on the flip side, if you go too much to that extreme, you can end up enabling them. One of the examples that I was thinking of is there's a book in the Al-Anon recovery, which Al-Anon is for family members of people who are struggling with addiction and alcoholism. And one of the examples, it's a really good example that they give there is I'll just say a spouse, right? Coming home drunk every single night, laying on the floor, like passed out. And the spouse will pick them up every single night and like bring them to the bed and put the blanket on. And then in the morning, the spouse that was, wasted wakes up and they're like, oh, okay, normal day, or try to be a normal day because things are okay. And there was like a shift at some point when the spouse, the one that was supporting them, who was actually enabling them, came home and said, wait a second, I want them to realize the consequences of their action, but I also want to be supportive. So the spouse put a blanket while he was, or in that case it was he, was on the floor, put a blanket on him on the floor so that he wakes up and sees like, oh, I'm being supported and not like judged for it. But yeah, I have an issue. I have a
Mhm.
problem.
And I'm sure that's critically important, especially for women that are in the middle of a family. Like, I would assume that if women are the caretakers, if they're playing the role of caretaker and they're suffering from the addiction, um, that may be exactly the hardest part, which is they probably don't feel as supported because they're needed, if you will, in ways that could be different. But at the
Mhm.
same time, they need both that support, but people need to be able to call them out and try to get them to get help.
Right. And I mean, it's very scary in those cases because they're like with little kids, and they, like you said, they're needed. Sometimes I hear women saying like, I don't get to fall apart. Like
Right.
I don't have that option. So I don't get to just say I have an issue because little people are relying on. So yeah, that makes it even harder for both them and their kids. And I would even say it goes further. There are so many times where like a mom will be talking to a child and the child is not even being heard. The same way that I was saying that like a spouse or a friend, but like when you're hugging your kid and you're thinking about when you can find your next drug or when you can find your next meal that's like part of your addiction or anything like that, and you're not really present with your kid, that's like one of the most difficult parts of addiction in terms of like how it impacts the family.
Wow. So, last question, and we thank you so much for being here and sharing your perspective. Um, sometimes people feel that um, it's I'm too far, or it's too hard, or I'm ruined. And I'm sure the shame that you mentioned earlier may even be exacerbated if there are little people that see things or rely on them. Or um, what does it look like for someone that is in recovery or recovered? Um, what's the hope that somebody could appreciate here now, if they're on, if you will, the wrong side of this and watching this and saying, wait, maybe I really should take it seriously? um, what does that look like on the other end?
So when you ask me that question, the first thing that comes to mind is all of the faces of the many women that I've worked with, both women who have children, who don't, who got married, who through this process. And the one thing that I would say is like a tremendous sense of gratitude that they even call themselves addicts or even went through the addiction process because for the recovery process, because they have real appreciation for life. So what it looks like externally is one thing. They look like you and me and, kind of everyone else walking on the streets that either, are okay or pretending to be okay. Lives with, families and successful careers and all of that. But internally, I would say that I'm sure the other speakers are talking about that, like spirituality and the meaningfulness of their lives. They're just enriched people that are living a life of gratitude. That's what I would
Mhm.
say.
Well, Miriam, thanks so much for being on the show here with us, and thanks for what you do for the community and the world at large, and thank you for shining your light on this world.
For having me.
Thanks so much for watching. For more content, like and subscribe, and be sure to tune in live every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern at theshabbatshow.com or right here on YouTube.